Hello and welcome to MEE Live. I'm Matilda Mallinson. It's Thursday, 27th of November, 2025. Today, can the UK's Palestine Action overturn its terrorist ban? But first, here are the top stories of the day. The United Nations Humanitarian Affairs Office, or OCHA, said last night that its partners in Gaza managed to distribute over 5,000 tarpaulins after heavy rains and winds destroyed thousands of tents over the past week. OCHA also said that 2,000 blankets were given to residents in Deir al-Balah and Khan Yunis. Officials in Gaza had previously said that Israel has only allowed in 30,000 tents since the ceasefire came into effect. Yet harsh weather conditions have meant Gaza's population now needs 300,000 tents, 10 times the amount. The Muslim Brotherhood has called US President Donald Trump's bid to ban chapters of the group as foreign terrorist organizations, quote, detached from reality. In a statement on X on Wednesday, the Muslim Brotherhood said Trump's terror allegations against them were unsupported by evidence. The ban focuses exclusively on the Muslim Brotherhood's chapters in Jordan, Egypt, and Lebanon. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE agents, are holding the mother of White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt's nephew in custody, multiple media outlets reported on Wednesday. Bruna Ferreira, aged 33, is currently being held at an ICE facility in Louisiana after she was taken into custody in Massachusetts earlier this month. Ferreira came to the US from Brazil as a child in 1998 and has an 11-year-old son with Michael Leavitt, Caroline's brother. Now, on to our main story, the Palestine Action judicial review. And yes, thank you to my producer. Legally, I have to preface this by saying Palestine Action is proscribed as a terrorist organisation in the UK, and any expression of support for the group is illegal. Although on that, a legal challenge is currently underway against the government's decision to proscribe Palestine Action as a terrorist organisation, a decision that has led to months of nationwide protests and thousands of arrests. It's the first time any group has been granted the right to appeal its prescription in a judicial review. Huda Amori, the group's co-founder, brought the case before London's High Court on Wednesday, arguing the ban interferes with freedom of speech and protest. We spoke to Ms. Amori on MEE Live the day before MPs voted in favour of the ban. That vote, in July, considered the collective prescription of Palestine Action alongside the neo-Nazi maniacs murder cult and the white supremacist Russian imperial movement. Amori told us she was shocked but not surprised.
And I don't think anyone should expect to be labelled a terrorist. Am I surprised? Not necessarily, but it's still really shocking that they would go this far to attack, people's rights in this way, in order to protect a foreign genocidal regime. And that's exactly what's happening here. But I think what they're doing is really exposing how far they are willing to go in order to protect the Zionist regime.
The group's ban, led by Prime Minister Keir Starmer's Labour government, followed an incident in which two members of Palestine Action broke into the RAF Brize Norton military base and sprayed red paint on Voyager planes that activists said were used in Israel's genocide in Gaza. In a separate incident in 2024, members of the group broke into the Bristol premises of Israeli defence firm Elbit Systems and reportedly destroyed quadcopter drones the activists also linked to destruction in Gaza. For this incident, 24 people linked to the group remain under arrest. Today is the second of 3 days of hearings over Palestine Action's prescription, with a final day scheduled for the 2nd of December next week. MEE reporter Areeb is currently inside the courthouse, but I spoke to him earlier this afternoon to find out what arguments and challenges have been laid out so far.
For a day and a half, and the kind of key arguments rest on 4 grounds. 1, that this is having effect on freedom of expression. 2, that the government didn't really consult relevant parties properly enough when they decided to prescribe Palestine Action. A 3rd one is they didn't account for the level of public support that Palestine Action has. And a fourth one is that the Home Office failed to kind of do the kind of relevant internal checks to determine whether or not Palestine Action met the threshold to be proscribed as a terrorist organization. And over the last few days, what we've seen in terms of the arguments that the lawyers representing the co-founder of Palestine Action, Huda Amori, has been that Palestine Action is inspired by the tradition of direct action in this country. So yesterday we had arguments from Raza Hussein KC saying that Palestine Action effectively models itself from the suffragettes. And if the suffragettes existed in today's kind of legal climate, what would have happened is that this government would have potentially prescribed them as a terrorist organization based on their tactics and what they use to kind of pursue their cause.
And yet this is the first time in British history that a direct action group has been branded a terrorist organisation. It's also the first time that a proscribed group has been granted a judicial review. How did we get to where we are now?
So typically when an organisation is prescribed as a terrorist organisation, Parliament has a mechanism in place called the Proscribed Organisations Appeals Commission, POA. Now, the problem with that process, so this year actually, Hamas used that mechanism to try and be proscribed as a terrorist organisation here in the UK. Now, what typically happens with a process like POA is that it could take between 12 to 24 months. And the kind of key argument that Palestine Action's lawyers, Amori's lawyers have been pursuing is that that's too long. And because of the fact that the genocide is ongoing in Gaza, that there is an immediacy to have this kind of conversation and have this kind of judicial review on whether or not Palestine Action should be banned as a terrorist organization. Now, Palestine Action has been around for a number of years. It's a direct action group that targets factories that are owned by Elbit System, which is an Israeli arms factory. And the kind of key trigger event you could argue that led to the proscription of Palestine Action in July this year was when activists from the group broke into RAF Rise Norton. And their argument, or their justification rather, for deciding to break into RAF Rise Norton was that it's a base that's used by the RAF to send planes to Cyprus, which are then sent to Gaza to do spy flights over Gaza on behalf of the Israeli government. And their argument is that the RAF and the British government is complicit in the genocide in Gaza. And one of the ways that is complicit is by facilitating these flights over Gaza.
Now, transparency issues have been raised. Obviously, these are sensitive national security issues. There are also always legal reporting restrictions with trials in process. And perhaps that's partially why there's been relatively little coverage given the significance of this case. But it also appears that a chunk of the trial will be done in secret itself. What exactly does that mean?
So a key part of this, of the 3-day hearing is that a portion of it will be done in secret. So the official name of this is closed material procedures. And what it is, it's an opportunity for the government to present evidence that is deemed classified to the judge to kind of justify why it's pursuing this prescription of Palestine Action. Now, the kind of controversial nature of this process is the fact that the evidence that will be presented against Ms. Amori in the court will not be seen by her and her legal team, meaning she'll have no idea what the government is actually arguing in terms of its case. Now, Amori's legal team can appoint a special advocate, but another twist in the kind of process is the fact that that special advocate won't be actually allowed to say what he or she may have seen during those closed proceedings, meaning if the ban is upheld against Palestine Action and it's based on this secret evidence, Amori will have no idea what was said against her or the group Palestine Action.
And not just Amori, but the British public. And one has to ask how that will sit with the British public, given that this has already been a very tricky issue for the government in terms of public reaction. Crowds were gathered outside the court on day one yesterday. Can you just tell us what the dynamic was like?
I mean, yesterday at 1 p.m., and so basically this time yesterday, what you saw behind me was over an estimated 200 people stood outside the Royal Courts of Justice, majority of them very elderly, pensioners, some of them couldn't even walk, you could say. And they simply sat down in front of the court and they held a cardboard sign and it wrote the following words: I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action, end quote. And what ended up happening was for approximately 4 to 6 hours, you saw the police one by one arresting approximately 140 people for holding this sign, because under the Terrorism Act here in the UK, any form of kind of support or anything that's deemed as supportive of a proscribed terrorist organization can lead to you being arrested by the police and for you to be treated as a terror suspect. And since the proscription of Palestine Action, a group called Defend Our Juries have been mobilizing against this ban, and they've been mobilizing across the UK. And what we've noticed is that we've seen a pattern of mass arrests of these individuals who've been protesting for Palestine Action, number one. Number two, in some cases, for example, in South Wales Police, we've seen house raids in the middle of the night, in the morning, of individuals arrested under Section 12 and 13 of the Terrorism Act. And one thing I'd like to highlight as well is that from our reporting at Middle East Eye, we found from analyzing the figures that have been produced by the police and the Home Office is that there have been 4 times more arrests since July to now, as opposed to the whole war on terror period from 2001 of individuals being arrested under Section 13 of the Terrorism Act for terrorism. And that just goes to show the scale and the level of kind of opposition and campaigning against this ban on Palestine Action.
Now, that was Areeb speaking outside the Royal Courts of Justice earlier this afternoon, and a really remarkable figure that MEE reporters pulled up there with the arrests under the Terror Act over the course of the so-called war on terror. Now, this Court of Appeal granted the review as it found reasonable grounds to argue that the ban of Palestine Action interfered with rights to free speech and protest in the UK. But it also pivots around specific criticisms here relating to the UK government's alleged complicity in Israel's genocide in Gaza. Here to talk about those wider implications of the case is prosecution solicitor Mutahir Ahmed, who is head of legal at the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians, or ICJP. Welcome to MEE Live, Mutahir.
Thank you. Can I just clarify, I do not work for Crown Prosecution Service anymore.
No, you're a former prosecutor with the Crown Prosecution Service, right? Can you just then explain for us what actually happens if Huda Amori is successful in overturning the ban of Palestine Action? I mean, there have already been thousands of arrests and a number of people associated with the group are currently in prison. Would de-proscription result in their release?
Okay, yeah, so the current proceedings are judicial review proceedings that are available for any person or institution or group to take against a public body in this country. So Palestine Action is judicially reviewing the Home Office decision that has proscribed them. And the High Court is there to examine the legality of Home Office decision to proscribe Palestine Action. And it's not the court's function to test the merits of the decision itself. So it is suggested that the correct procedures were not followed when Palestine Action was proscribed by the Home Office. They did not follow their own policy, did not follow their own guidelines. And whilst it is difficult to assess the likelihood of success, because the arguments are still being presented in court, we can see what will happen if Palestine Action is successful in these proceedings. The first point would be the lifting of the ban. The High Court could issue an authoritative judgment and order which would determine that Home Secretary's decision to proscribe Palestine Action was unlawful, and that would effectively and immediately lift the ban. As a result of that, what we will see is the action taken against those people hundreds of people or thousands of people who have been arrested and charged with criminal offences under the Terrorism Act because they have supported Palestine Action and they have raised voices in opposed to genocide. Now, all these charges that have been brought, Crown Prosecution Service will have to review their decision to charge them. it is likely that they will offer no evidence to drop all these charges. And those people who are awaiting any charging decision may receive a letter or a decision that suggests that no further action will be taken against them. Finally, I would like to mention that a government loss would be seen as a significant victory for civil liberties and the right to protest, potentially having a chilling effect on the future use of broad counterterrorism powers against the direct action groups in this country. You would have noticed by now that human rights groups like Liberty and Amnesty International UK have intervened in these proceedings. And the point they are arguing is exactly the same, that if the prescription is upheld and if this prescription against Palestine Action is not overturned by the court, then it sets a very dangerous example for the future activist groups in this country.
So the ramifications of this review are pretty significant either way. We won't know the outcome until next week. However, already on day one of the trial, concerns have been raised about a complication that occurred. That was at the last minute. The judge who was expected to preside over the trial was removed without explanation. The Ministry of Justice and Judiciary both declined to comment when approached by The Guardian. Now, the trial is instead being heard by a panel of 3 judges, but the judge who was removed, Mr. Justice Chamberlain, is the person who granted permission for the case to go ahead. And while these last-minute replacements, correct me if I'm wrong, are unusual, the same thing happened to the same judge earlier this year, also on a trial relating to Palestinian protests. This was the legal challenge over the UK's sale of F-35 fighter jet parts to Israel. So people have questioned this, among them your colleagues at ICJP. What's the problem here?
So it's a very significant issue here that the government cannot duck. For instance, it is a sudden and unexplained shift from a single judge who had already had conduct of this case, managed the case from the very early stages, managed the timetable of this case, to an entirely new panel, and that judge has been replaced by 3 judges, which is deeply concerning. Not because it has happened, it is known to have happened in previous cases as well, but particularly without any justification or explanation coming from the decision makers of this decision. In a matter as sensitive as this one, involving allegations linked to Palestine and public interest activism of significant constitutional importance, the integrity and transparency of judicial process is extremely important and must be beyond any question. At the very least, the court should provide a clear and credible explanation of such a change. You are absolutely right that we have seen a similar change in the past. This appears to be systematic now, as it happened in the F-35 case, in which ICJP was involved by providing evidence to support Al-Haq and Glan in their judicial review proceedings. And once again, we see what I would say is a dark art that is applied in these cases. And the executive branch, by changing the panels, are interfering with the legislative process of this country. And it is even more worrying when this is applied to the wider context of the Justice Secretary calling for the scrapping of the juries. We've seen David Lammy has been in the news quite recently for not satisfied, for suggesting that we should scrap the jury system. Now that system, that process goes centuries back. It is enshrined in the justice system of this country, and he wants to scrap it completely.
Mutahir, you've rightly just a little press for time, and you've rightly pointed, like, there have been a series of attacks on protest rights in the UK over the past years. Yes. You know, we had the massive protests over the policing bill just a few years ago. Juries are now coming under, so you're seeing attacks on the judicial process. However, there is something potentially quite particular about this ban, this judicial review, and that is to do with the subject of Palestine. I mean, your organisation is an organisation for justice for Palestinians. If you're weighing in, presumably you see this as a particular issue of justice for Palestinians. Can you just lay out the implications of what's happening now for Palestine?
Of course. The proscription of Palestine Action represents an alarming overreach of the state which has designated a non-violent direct action group as a terrorist organization. And what happened is that it is marking an infringement on the freedom of expression in the UK. These laws, the terrorism laws, are intended to proscribe organizations like ISIS and National Action as terrorist organization, not the activist groups like Palestine Action as terrorist organization. What we have seen is ICC handing out the arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant. The ICJ in January 2024 issued a publication where it suggested that there's a plausible risk of genocide in the last 2 years. We have seen for the past 2 years, since October 2023, the live coverage of mass killing, bombardment of Gaza, destruction of healthcare system, and breakdown of infrastructure in Gaza. And what Palestine Action was doing is taking non-violent activist actions which were purely aimed to prevent further harm to the civilians and innocent Palestinians. And government action reflects that they are hell-bent in supporting Israel and its genocide. I want to take you back a little bit that we should not forget why the government proscribed this group at the first place. The group broke into Braze Norton Air Base. They targeted specific airbase because there are direct flights from that airbase to Cyprus, another airbase, where RAF Shadow R1 aircraft have been conducted surveillance operations on Gaza to support Israel and providing Israel intelligence. And this is where the government is complicit in the Israel's genocide. And what government is doing is, rather than defending the right to protest, defending the freedom of expression, they are hiding behind these actions to complicit and distracting the public from their own complicity.
Mutahir, Ahmed, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Now, I think probably legally wise just to reiterate that Palestine Action is a proscribed organisation, and Middle East Eye is not encouraging any support for the organisation that would be illegal. But these questions of free speech, free protest, complicity in genocide in the case of the UK government, these are all being fought out not just in the courtroom, but also unfolding dramatically in the public sphere, where thousands have been arrested under the Terrorism Act for holding signs reading the words, quote, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action." It's a charge that carries a potential sentence of 14 years in prison. Yet it hasn't deterred protesters who have been mobilising in coordination with the judicial hearing now underway. Tamara Himani reports.
The judicial review is being accompanied by 2 weeks of nationwide protests, coordinated by a group called Defend Our Juries, in which over 140 people have been arrested. Demonstrators have repeatedly protested against the ban since it first came into effect in July, and over 2,000 have been arrested by police.
In the 60s, during the civil rights movement, people were beaten off the street by police, but people still kept going and kept marching because the cause was too big and too important to be told that it was illegal by any government. And the idea that the British government have banned an organisation and made them a terrorist organisation for protesting a genocide is utterly ridiculous.
But the response of law enforcement has differed across the country. While arrests in Scotland and Northern Ireland have been minimal, their counterparts in England and Wales have taken a much more sweeping approach. For example, in Cardiff earlier this year, South Wales police reportedly raided arrestees' homes and seized belongings, including that of 2 elderly Quakers. London's Met Police arrested 532 people in a single day in the wake of the ban, over 100 of them in their 70s and half aged 60 or older.
It's absurd that being here with these signs, these really simple and peaceful messages, can now potentially label you a terrorist along with Hezbollah and any other. It's so absurd.
This week alone, police in England and Wales have arrested demonstrators at every site, but no arrests appear to have been made in Scotland or Northern Ireland. Given the protests are largely non-violent and feature similar signs, the varied response seems to be a result of local police discretion in the absence of clear guidelines on what violates the law. Section 13 of the Terrorism Act prohibits displaying clothing or articles in a public place if it raises reasonable suspicion that the person is a member or supporter of a proscribed group. But legal critics argue the breadth of that mandate gives police considerable leeway in deciding how to enforce it amid widespread support for the right to non-violent protest and solidarity with the Palestinian cause. In Northern Ireland, where no arrests have been made during this week's demonstrations, dozens attended protests in the cities of Belfast and Derry, carrying the same placards and making similar statements as their counterparts arrested in mainland UK.
The Terrorism Act was used against us in the 1970s here because of opposition to internment. And the Terrorism Act has been introduced again, a new Terrorism Act passed through Westminster half a century after we thought we were rid of all that type of thing. We've got a new Terrorism Act sort of introduced, and people carrying these placards around here, they are at the risk of fairly long terms of imprisonment for standing with a placard. Where is freedom gone?
We'll now turn to the situation in Northern Ireland, where policing has been drastically different to mainland UK. Why is this the case, and what questions does it raise about the law's enforcement as a whole? I'm now joined by Northern Ireland political editor for BBC News, Mark Devenport. Mark, thank you for joining me today.
Good to see you, Matilda. I'm the former political editor for BBC Northern Ireland.
That's the BBC's loss. But what is so distinct, just tell us, about how police in Northern Ireland are implementing the Palestine Action law, and what explains this distinction?
Well, there's a clear disparity, I think, in the tactics used by the PSNI, which is the police force in Northern Ireland, and other forces elsewhere in the UK. And this is clear from the figures because there's been more than 2,000 arrests of Palestine Action supporters, the vast majority of them in England or in Great Britain, whereas in Northern Ireland, it's been something like 3 arrests and 6 files sent to the prosecution service. So much, much smaller number. And in the most recent wave of protests, the PSNI didn't make any arrests. They simply monitored the situation. I think the reason for the difference there is that what we have is a situation in Northern Ireland where we have a number of homegrown proscribed groups, about 14 of them, and that's the legacy of Northern Ireland's troubles, the conflict that we had here over whether this particular part of the world should be a part of the UK, which it is now, or should join together with United Ireland. And there was a long and bloody war called the Troubles, which was fought, and there was a peace agreement about 25 years ago. But we still have some factions that are linked to armed groups, and they still exist. And generally, the government's approach has not been to have arrests of people responsible for acts of support for those factions. You still see in certain areas of Belfast murals featuring, for instance, masked, balaclava-clad fighters for one or other of these groups. You still occasionally get events where people will carry banners commemorating one of these groups. And so the difficulty for the PSNI is if they come in a heavy-handed way against Palestine Action supporters and don't do anything about these other more homegrown groups, they'll be seen, I suppose, to be guilty of double standards.
Thank you. The PSNI, just for viewers, is the police service of Northern Ireland. You said double standards could be identified if the police apply a more heavy-handed approach to pro-Palestine supporters. I think, firstly, we just need to understand what the two sides of that double standards are. You know, the troubles in Ireland go back to this dispute between Catholics and Protestants, or Republicans and Unionists. To what extent are Catholics disproportionately associated with the pro-Palestine sentiment? Because I'm sort of assuming that would be the double standard that would come into question. And why? Can you just quickly explain the roots of those affiliations?
Well, I suppose the sort of basic charge of double standards would be simply applying the law in relation to the new ban on Palestine Action rather than pre-existing bans. But you're right that there is a historical context to this. During the Troubles, by and large, although not every supporter of Palestine is a Catholic and not every supporter of Israel is a Protestant, by and large, Catholic Irish nationalists tended to associate with the Palestine case. They saw themselves as oppressed people battling colonialism together. And the Protestant Unionist side, which is pro-British, tended to instead associate themselves with the Israeli cause. They saw themselves as a misunderstood settler population who was battling terror. So that kind of historic leaning is seen now in the streets of Northern Ireland, where if you're in, say, a Protestant part of Belfast, you might well see Israeli flags flying in the streets. And if you're in a Catholic and nationalist part of Belfast, you could quite easily see Palestinian flags flying there.
And now the second part of my follow-up is, what are we to take away from the fact that this is posing such difficulties for policing in Northern Ireland? Either they're inconsistently applying terror law within Ireland, or it's being inconsistently applied between Ireland, Northern Ireland and the UK mainland. Does this point to a problem with law enforcement, or is the problem with the law itself?
Well, I mean, I think that obviously there's a difficulty on a tactical level, and that's what the police have been doing in taking, if you like, a light touch approach in Northern Ireland. But there's obviously a more fundamental question about this ban on Palestine action, whether it was heavy-handed. We've seen all the arguments that have been put forward already in the judicial review that this is, it is argued by Palestine Action supporters, more of a group that's engaging in direct action and isn't intent like other terror groups, whether they were in Northern Ireland or elsewhere around the world, on causing loss of life. So there's that kind of fundamental problem there. And that was actually, interestingly, in Parliament, brought up by a former Northern Ireland Secretary, Peter Hain, who's got an interesting perspective on this because he's been in charge of Northern Ireland policy in the past for the British government, but he has also personally got a very long track record of being a direct action activist fighting apartheid in South Africa. And he made a very forthright speech, essentially saying
Mark,
that this policy was intellectually bankrupt.
Sorry. We've actually got that clip from Peter Hain, which we can play quickly so people can see it for themselves.
Nazi-like US racists, and here in the United Kingdom, the IRA also committed terrible terrorist atrocities, targeting or killing innocent civilians, properly and rightly labelled terrorists. This government is treating Palestine Action as equivalent to Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, which is intellectually bankrupt, politically unprincipled, and morally wrong.
Sorry to interrupt you, Mark, but maybe you can tell us now what stuck with you about that speech.
Yeah, well, obviously he was making the argument there that this is a heavy-handed approach, that this was an organisation which was quite akin to the kind of direct action that he himself would have engaged in the past in relation to apartheid in South Africa, or even that the suffragettes would have engaged in relation to trying to get the women the right to vote within the UK. And I suppose the question will be, even if it turns out that this ban on Palestine action is within the letter of the law, because the Terrorism Act 2000 does refer to groups intent on causing serious damage to property, and it's pretty clear that Palestine Action has been engaged in that, whether having moved ahead and prescribed them and put them on the same kind of list as groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, whether that will in some way, I suppose, damage public trust in that whole aspect of the law. Does it call into question exactly what kind of groups should be prescribed and what kind of groups maybe it's going too far to prescribe? So that's, if you like, a wider political question rather than the legalities of this case.
Mark Devenport, thank you so much for your time. It's been really, really great to have your insights here on Middle East Eye.